Sebastian Jungo, in his book Tribe, recounts his experience as a journalist in Sarajevo during the 3-year siege in the 90s. During the siege, roughly 20% of the population was wounded or killed. And he describes this experience that he witnessed. There was a high-rise building that had been completely destroyed, the windows blown out. There was shrapnel all over it, and there was a middle-aged man in a courtyard in a business suit, hunched over, gathering dead twigs with an aluminum pot, adjusting it, lighting these twigs with a cigarette lighter. And he said when he saw this middle-aged man, just with everything destroyed in the background, he felt like he had witnessed the apocalypse. He left, and 20 years later, he went back to Sarajevo, and he was surprised by the ways that people expressed their experience of the war, of the siege, of the violence that they had experienced. He talked to this woman who was a journalist and 17 years old when the war broke out. Just weeks after it started, she was hit by shrapnel and her leg severely damaged. In the hospital, she went through surgery to repair her leg without any anesthesia. And the hospital was so packed, there were bodies everywhere, that one morning she woke up and there was a dead body actually on top of her. Eventually, she went home. In this apartment that she lived in, there were other apartments in the area, and they gathered together and formed like a cooperative. They planted gardens around the area and shared what food was produced from those gardens. They shared everything that they had. And there was a basement in one of the apartment that functioned as a bomb shelter. And this is where the teenagers would hang out, and there were mattresses on the floor, and that's where they lived and they slept. And the boys sometimes would go away and fight for like 10 days, and then they would come back and they would tell stories and they would play games and they would laugh together. And she said that this experience was kind of like a liberation. The love that we shared there was enormous. Now, because of the surgery, she had lost a lot of weight and she had a hard time putting weight back on. And her parents were worried about her, and so they found a way for her to escape to Italy so that she could survive and get better. So she managed to escape, and after her health started improving, she said that the loneliness that she experienced there was unbearable. So unbearable that she found a way to get back to Sarajevo. Now, if you can just imagine how hard it would have been to escape a city under siege, how hard would it have been to return to a city under siege? And why would you want to? But she said the loneliness that she experienced was so unbearable. So the author of this book, Tribe, asked her, were people happier during the war? And she said, we were the happiest, and we laughed more. In this book, the author describes the positive effects that war can have on people and a community. Now, this connection is nothing new. Emile Durkheim, who was a French sociologist, made a connection between war and a decrease in suicide rates. And the author of this book basically argues that war, the threat of violence, disaster, even poverty brings people together in a way that they desperately need. That it cultivates connection and forces people to turn their energy away from themselves and towards each other. Now, we don't live in a culture or context where the threat of war or violence or disaster is a reality, although the reality of climate change is kind of always looming. But the threat of loneliness in our culture is very real. I read in a recent article that 1 in 5 Canadians are lonely, and that loneliness is actually as detrimental to your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We are overconnected with technology and social media, but more lonely than ever before. And with this loneliness, how will we find connection? Where will we find community? And is it possible that there is something that actually brings us together, that cultivates connection, that turns our energy away from ourselves and to each other even more than the threat of war or violence or disaster? For the last couple weeks, we've been talking about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And when we say yes to Jesus, when we decide we want Jesus' story to become our story, his will and his way to define us the way we think and our thoughts the way that we act, we also say yes to community. To say yes to Jesus is to say yes to community. And in the book of Mark, which we have been hopping through the last couple weeks, Jesus says that anyone who does the will of his Father is actually his family. In Mark chapter 3, verse 31, in this passage, he says this. It says, "Then Jesus' mother and brothers came to see him. They stood outside and they sent word for him to come out and talk with them. There was a crowd sitting around Jesus, and someone said, 'Your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you.' Jesus replied, 'Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?' Then he looked at those around him and said, 'Look, these are my mother and brothers. Anyone who does God's will is my brother and sister and mother.'" So when we decide to follow Jesus, not only do we become a part of a community, but we become a part of a family. To say yes to Jesus is to say yes to family. Followers of Jesus are marked by community. But before I get into what it means to be a part of a discipleship community, a community of people following Jesus, and all of the positive aspects of that, I think that we have to acknowledge that there are many people who are part of a Christian community who actually don't have a positive experience. There are a lot of people who have expectations that the Christian community, a community of followers of Jesus, that in that community they will find hope and grace and love, and it'll be a safe space, and they are gravely disappointed and hurt. That reality is not lost on me. And that reality is not lost on Jesus either. Actually, earlier in the same chapter of Mark, it says one time, in verse 20, one time Jesus entered a house and the crowd began to gather again. Soon he and his disciples couldn't even find time to eat. When his family heard what was happening, they tried to take him away. "He's out of his mind," they said. But the teachers of religious law who had arrived from Jerusalem said, "He's possessed by Satan, the prince of demons. That's where he gets the power to cast out demons." And then Jesus responds with this passage about blaspheming the Holy Spirit, which I don't have time to get into, but if you have questions about that, you should talk to Chris. He'll explain all of that for you. But here in this passage, we see a community, Jesus' own family, the people who you would expect to embrace Jesus, to be excited, to support him, to stand in solidarity with him, actually reject him. His own family says he is out of his mind. The religious teachers of the law, the people who were expecting a king, a Messiah, to come and rescue them, they actually reject Jesus. They say he is possessed by Satan. For many people, the church has not been a safe space. The church does not live up to the expectation that they have. That reality is not lost on me. In my seminary application, when I applied in 2014, I said something like, if I had to choose one word to describe my experiences with church, it would be disappointment. When I was 4, my parents moved to Fresno to plant a church. And many people who grow up with a pastor as a mom or dad may feel that as a burden, may have some resentment over that season of their life. But I have a lot of happy memories of that season, of waking up early and helping my parents set up, putting out the signs, going door to door, having people at our house all of the time. It felt like we had all these friends and an extended family. We'd go on vacation with them. I thought it was great. Well, 8 years later, there was a conflict in our congregation. People who were really close to us, who we spent a lot of time with, who we considered part of our family, started leaving. And eventually the church split and it closed down. And this experience of losing these people who were close to me, of having people who were over at our house all the time, all of a sudden not seeing them anymore, that experience shaped my understanding of church. And when we have these kinds of experiences in church, what can be so challenging is that the church ideally reflects who God is. We expect the church to be a loving, a gracious place, a place of hope. And when it isn't, it forces us to wrestle with a lot of questions like, God, how could you let this happen? God, these are your people. God, I'm putting all of my heart and my energy and my focus towards you. Shouldn't you protect me from this? And those feelings and those questions and those experiences are important, and they need to be acknowledged. The church is not always a safe and encouraging space, but there are times and there are moments when it does feel like family. I had a friend a couple of years ago in seminary who went through a really rough season of life, just one of those seasons where you feel like, could anything else like bad happen? Just like everything is going wrong, and he lost his job. And at the time, his wife wasn't working. She was staying at home with her son. And because he was in seminary, she started looking for a job, but there was this period where neither of them were working. And their financial situation was getting really tricky. And one day at church, she shared a prayer request and just was honest and said, we have enough money for 6 weeks to live for 6 more weeks. That's it. And afterwards, someone in the church came up to him and gave him a check. And he looked briefly at it, and it said, $200. And he thought, wow, this is so generous. Thank you so much. And later on, he realized that it was actually $2,000. That someone in the church just went over and gave him $2,000. And there were other people in the church who gave them food and showed up for them and prayed for them. And this is what church can be like family. People standing in solidarity with one another so that when one person grieves, actually everyone grieves. That people walk with you through every season of life. They laugh with you, they cry with you, they encourage you, they pray for you. We do fun things together. That's okay to have fun in church, right? Church can be like family. But even family has its challenges and has conflict. You can't actually have community, the support, the encouragement, the solidarity without challenges and conflict. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pastor and theologian, actively resisted Nazi oppression in his book, Life of Fellowship, said the person who loves their dream of community will destroy community. The person who loves their dream of community will destroy community. The idea is that the person who has this ideal community, this vision of the perfect community where everybody always gets along and there's no challenges, having that ideal actually ruins community because that will never happen. There are some people, maybe you know them, who are kind of sitting around waiting for like the perfect relationship, waiting for the perfect marriage, the perfect friendship, the perfect community. They're sitting there waiting for that along with their unicorn. Like, that's never going to happen. You can't have any of that without challenges and conflict. You can't have community without conflict. Now, I recognize that conflict for a lot of us makes us very uncomfortable. So I just want to take a second. When I say conflict, what is the first word that comes to mind? Just shout it out. Fight. What else? Tension. War. Did someone say war? Yep. Okay, war. Anything else? Passive aggressiveness. Conflict certainly makes a lot of us uncomfortable. In his book, Reconcile, John Paul Lederach, who is an international peace activist, wrote that conflict in itself is not sin. But sin may enter into the situation depending on how we approach conflict, how we deal with it, and especially how we treat each other. Interestingly, that when we think about conflict, a lot of our connections, connotations are negative: war, violence, tension. But he argues that conflict is not in itself sin, that conflict is not necessarily bad. And he connects this idea to the creation story, that when God created the world, we see a couple different commitments. We see a commitment to diversity. Animals of every kind, plants of every kind, male and female, there is diversity. We also see a commitment to choice. There is a freedom of choice, and when you combine diversity and choice, you get conflict. Just imagine for a second sitting in a group of your peers, coworkers, family, friends, whatever it is. There's some problem that needs to be solved, and everyone gets to write down what they think needs to happen, the solution. What are the chances that everyone writes down the exact same thing? That's never going to happen, right? You have diversity, you have choice, you have conflict. And conflict is not necessarily bad, right? But here's the thing, I think this is how we often handle conflict. Something happens, let's say there's a coworker who initiates a meeting, they're equal with you, they initiate a meeting with your supervisor, and you feel like you should be a part of that conversation. Why aren't they inviting me into that conversation, right? Conflict. Or maybe it's a friend who posts a picture on Facebook with all your other friends. They had a dinner or they went to some kind of event and they didn't invite you. Well, why didn't they invite me? Or maybe it's someone who you live with that's just really messy and it drives you nuts. Why can't they just keep things a little more clean? Conflict. Now, we could go to this person and say, why didn't you invite me into that conversation? Or, I didn't get invited to this, I'm just curious, why not? Or, you know what, I feel really disrespected the way that you're living around our house because I try to keep things clean. But I don't think we normally do that. Instead, we sort of just let the feelings fester a little bit. We get angry, we get frustrated, and over time, that person becomes the problem. The problem is not that you wanted to be a part of that conversation or that you have different ways of living in your house, they're messy or clean. It's them. They are so selfish and inconsiderate with the way that they live around your house. How dare they not invite me into this conversation? It's because they're threatened by me because I'm better at my job. That's what this really is about. They didn't invite me to hang out with their friends because they're worried because I'm getting close to so-and-so and they're jealous of our relationships. They are the problem, right? I notice that this actually happens with Jesus. Jesus' family, they're thrown off by something. Something bothers them, but that's not the problem. The problem is Jesus. He's out of his mind. These religious leaders, they're thrown off by something. Maybe they're uncomfortable because they feel their authority being threatened. There's change happening. Jesus isn't the person they expected him to be. Jesus is the problem. He's possessed by Satan. The other person becomes the problem. And then we come up with like a list of everything that they've done wrong. It's no longer just the one thing anymore. It's the tone that they used with me, right? It's that post on Facebook that was totally about me. It didn't say my name in it, but everybody knows it was about me, right? And not only are they messy, but they are always late. They are so selfish and inconsiderate, and it drives me crazy. And now we have this whole list, and the feelings just continue to fester. And notice that the language and the posture towards this person changes. Now there's this distrust in your relationship. You distrust their motives. Your language towards them changed. You're less respectful. And so what do? Do we go talk to the person? Or do we talk to everybody else? Right? We call up our friends, our siblings, whoever. We're like, can you believe that they did this to me? Did you see that post on social media? It was totally about me. They are so disrespectful. They are so inconsiderate. And we talk to everyone else, which the religious leaders also did to Jesus. They're often bothered by the things that Jesus did. And instead of talking to Jesus about it, they talk to each other. And then eventually they form a coalition against Jesus. The conflict in the book of Mark actually escalates very quickly. By the end of chapter 3, they're plotting to kill Jesus. That's often how we respond to conflict. Because of this church experience that I had, I thought, when conflict comes up, that we just avoid it. Best not to talk about it. Or, it comes up and that just means the relationship is over. Now, granted, there's appropriate times for that. Sometimes relationships do have to end, or at least for a while. But just because conflict comes up doesn't mean the relationship is over. And I actually realized that because I didn't have the tools to work through conflict, because it made me uncomfortable because I didn't want to deal with it, that my relationships actually lacked intimacy, like healthy intimacy. That I was starving myself of the community that I desperately needed and wanted because I didn't know how to work through conflict. And I think often what would happen If instead, instead of blaming the other person, getting our list of wrongs, talking to everyone else, if we talk to the other person first, it just might go something like this. Hey, I felt really disrespected, and honestly, like my voice or my opinion didn't matter because I wasn't invited into that conversation. And I'm just curious why you didn't invite me. And they might say, oh, actually, I had that conversation with our supervisor because we had a conflict about something else. And so we had to have this, heart to heart. So that's why I didn't invite you. Have you ever had one of those moments where you think something is one thing and then it's totally different? You're like, oh, shoot, okay. Or you go to your friend and you say, you know what? I was hurt that you didn't invite me to this. And they say, wasn't that like your mom's birthday weekend? That's why I didn't invite you. I didn't want you to feel like you had to come or to feel bad that you didn't. And honestly, I should have invited you anyways and let you make that decision. But that's why I didn't invite you. Right? It's something completely different from what we imagined in our head. And if we went to the person we live with and we said, I feel really disrespected because of the way that you live and I try to keep things clean. Could we try to work something out? Maybe like make sure the dishes are cleaned up before we go to bed. They might say, yeah. And then in the conversation, maybe your coworker says, I really value your opinion and your work ethic, but I'm just curious, like, how do you feel about your work performance? And in the conversation, you realize that it's actually not them who feels insecure, but you who feels insecure about your work performance. When you talk to your friend and you say, why didn't you invite me? And they say, I care a lot about our friendship. Do you trust that? Do you trust me? And you realize you don't. And what is really behind the trust issue there? Sometimes when we work through conflict, not only is it an opportunity to deepen our relationship, to grow in intimacy, but we learn things about ourselves. It causes us to self-reflect and think, actually, how am I contributing to this conflict and what's going on in me? We learn something about the other people and other person. We learn something about ourselves. But the issue is, working through conflict is difficult and it's uncomfortable because we have to be vulnerable. We have to say, this is how this made me feel. We have to acknowledge those feelings, those insecurities, those fears. And of course, there's a question of, what if the other person doesn't hear me? What if they don't acknowledge my concerns or my needs? What if they deny what they said or what they did? And there's all those fears involved. So we have to face the fear and the insecurity and ourselves. But the reality is, without conflict, we can't have community. Without conflict, you can't have healthy intimacy. You can't have the community that we were created to have. So I want to let you talk amongst yourselves for a bit about conflict. I have some questions. How do you respond to conflict? Like, what is your initial reaction? When a conflict happens, do you withdraw? Do you get angry? Is your natural instinct to go and just have an honest conversation? Maybe. Do you do like what Mel talked about, the passive aggressive? I'm just going to give them the cold shoulder, ignore them. What is your initial reaction? Have you ever had an experience where conflict has actually deepened relationship? Where in the process you've learned something about yourself? And what tools or methods do you use that help you work through conflict in a healthy way? So take a few minutes and talk amongst yourselves about those questions. I'm curious to hear what you've shared. Does anyone have an experience where they feel like conflict brought them closer to someone that they want to share? It's okay if not. Alex, was that a thing or no? No, okay.
I said I wasn't listening. He was telling me what you're talking about.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thanks, guys. Perfect. Yes, Chris.
It's very recent, and it's weird, and it was out of nowhere. So I had a friend about 22 years ago. No, 27 years ago. I'm older. We
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really think anything of it or reflect on it until about a month ago. I got a Facebook message from him, basically saying how hurt he was that we just let our relationship fall apart, our friendship fall apart, and how, you know, he had harbored a lot of bitterness and hurt toward me because, yeah, he felt like he had reached out. Anyway, long story short, it's like I got that and it like rocked me for about an hour. I think it was about an hour. And then I just sent him a message and said, my first draft was, I'm sorry that you feel hurt. No, you're hurt. Sorry. I'm sorry I hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
Because I hurt you.
Yeah.
How do we move forward?
Yeah.
And we're having breakfast on Tuesday. So I mean,
That's great.
right? Like it usually does deepen the relationship.
Yep. Yep.
Maybe not right away, but
Yeah.
eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Chris.
No problem.
Does anyone want to share any tools or methods that they have to work through conflict? Things that they use? Yeah, Matt.
We talked about, well, the first question, which is related to this one.
Mhm.
I can't think of a meaningful relationship that I have where I haven't gone through at least moderate to significant conflict
Yeah.
at this stage of my life, which is kind of interesting. But the tool that Darcy and I talked about, for us at least, was the Enneagram.
Yeah.
Which is just a great tool for your own self-assessment.
Mhm.
And to understand the bias that you bring into conflict.
Mhm.
And then to also be a little bit more empathetic, because we engage in conflict very differently.
Mhm.
It's comically different for us at least, so, yeah.
Yeah. So understanding how the other person approaches conflict, and then you can kind of meet them in the middle,
Yeah.
different styles. Yeah, it's been really helpful. Cam, you want to share?
I was just gonna say, I think it's obvious we can talk about it a lot, but not engaging in it in the moment. Like,
Yep.
that hurt me, I'm gonna go away and think about it,
Yep.
process it, and come
Mhm.
back later.
Yep.
Rather than when it's raw,
Mhm.
and trying to have a discussion about it. So
Yeah.
great.
Yep. Yep. Letting your emotions cool down,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, Heidi?
One of my coworkers has a saying that has been really good, like when you're, like, he says, like, you're supposed to, like, halt. Don't respond if you're, like, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired.
Nice.
To anything.
That's helpful. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think so often, and we tend to think of overcoming conflict, you know, relating that to idea of some sort of, you know, victory or success or, you know, winning
Mhm.
sort of thing. But I think so often when we come in with that sort of, not intentionally, but just as the default attitude, we're
Yep.
not really paying attention to it. It never obviously tends to go very well. That because everyone's just interested in their own interest. But as you're talking about, when you're coming with that attitude of community and focusing your energy outward, not towards your own. Like if you're trying to resolve the conflict by being right or whatever,
Yes.
you know, it doesn't really matter if you're right. You're still not going to resolve that conflict.
Yeah. So what's the goal of the conversation? Like to convince the other person I'm right, or like to listen and understand their perspective?
And I think
Totally.
we all know that.
Yeah.
Like, it's a very basic thing, but
Mhm.
it's a different thing to know it and to remember it in that
Totally.
moment, right?
Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
One of the things I think Chris and I have acknowledged is family of origin and how our parents dealt with conflict.
Yep.
And understanding that sort of seeped into
Yeah.
our relationship and
Yep.
how I've watched that model. And so that was a really good discussion at the beginning of our relationship to say, my mom was this, my dad was this, that's why I act this way.
Yep.
So I had sort of the worst of both.
Yeah.
Sort of the passive aggressive and the yeller.
Yeah.
Just like my mom and dad, all combined, trying to deal with conflict.
Mhm.
And it is helpful to have a partner husband who's very direct
Mhm.
and say, we have an issue, sit down, we're not leaving until this is worked out.
Yep.
And that's healthy for someone who lived in a home that was very passive aggressive
Mhm.
and very yelly, so you couldn't hear really what the other person was doing.
Mhm.
So to have someone direct to kind of like focus in and that time, so that's been really helpful. I want to be more like that, but I think that to be very direct and then take the space and time to deal with it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Jen, did you have something? Sorry. No?
Yeah, I should
Okay.
but I guess
Okay.
Guys, I was gonna speak on behalf of Chris, who's not here, but he's a psychologist and he does lots of marital counseling, and he
Yeah.
always draws this infinity loop, and it's kind of like your actions cause my feelings, and my actions cause your feelings, and you get stuck in this loop, and it just repeats, and so one little conflict then becomes like the baseline of everything, and if you can sit down and identify what those actions and feelings are, then it tends to not reproduce.
Yeah.
My hand runs out of $1,000.
Yeah. Thank you. Much appreciated. Cam, you wanted to say something too, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, just similar to what Melinda was saying, I thought it was really interesting that you could identify where your relationship with conflict kind of started when you were 12 years old. And I was just trying to think about my own, like what's my response to conflict, and then where does that come from? Can I think back to some early experience where that's how I figured out how to deal with conflict? And
Yeah.
it might just be a healthy exercise for all of us to do, like think back and try to remember what's my earliest recollection, how is that handled, and then is that similar to what I do today?
Yep.
I think most understand.
Yep. Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, I was thinking, we too talked about the Enneagram, like Matt, and as a 2 on the Enneagram, I have really valued being liked and approved of, and so it's been a lifelong journey that I'm still on to understand that conflict isn't bad, that we can come, because my default in my family of growing up and everything, sisters especially, it was always to like, we need to talk about this right now, because I think underneath that was because you being mad at me makes me feel like
Right.
now I'm not enough, I'm not approved of, or
Right.
whatever, so let's talk, let's figure it out, and just having that space and learning how to let the conflict just breathe, and this is not because I'm not enough, or I'm not lovable, approved of, etc.
Yep.
But just that's been a really still hard for me to just not, let's fix this right now because I need to get to you liking me.
Yeah. So it's okay, like we can come back to the conversation, but let's just take some space first.
That Hulk thing is really good.
Yes, halt, yes. Yeah, Megan, I'm just taking the time.
We
Okay.
talked a little bit about having different conflicts response styles depending on the relationship.
Right.
And Alex kind of phrased it as saying, the depth of kind of love and intimacy in a relationship sometimes allows the conflict to be. So, for instance, because I know Alex loves me and we're committed to being married forever, that I can be more direct in my conflict style because he's stuck with me to a certain, you know what I mean?
Right,
And
yeah.
the love can kind of absorb it.
Yep.
Whereas I would be more of an avoider in having an awkward conversation
Sure.
in a relationship where there's not that depth of love and intimacy to kind of absorb that, and how it can be, strange to feel like I'm a, blunt conflict okay person in this relationship, whereas in other spaces I would avoid something that would be difficult, and just kind of thinking through, because our relationships tend to be less intimate in our kind of culture because people are more surface and more busy.
Right.
Does that mean we avoid conflict more because there's not that love to kind of be the baseline to allow those conflicts to happen and still move forward from them?
That's a good question. Yeah, maybe one more comment, Kathy.
Just based on that, extending that, sometimes working through conflict, especially someone that you don't have that deeper relationship, working through equals not really resolving it.
Right.
I'm just saying there's some people in your lives that are very complicated, and sometimes it's just that's not, you can just leave it at that.
Yeah.
For both people's safety.
Yeah. Sometimes there's no clear way and way to work it out. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen in our relationships, in our community. We get to choose how we respond to it, and if we approach it as an opportunity to deepen relationship and intimacy. I know someone who, a couple years ago, they're married, their spouse came to them and shared something that they had done that was deeply hurtful and put their marriage in a fragile place. And the thing that they did not only affected their marital relationship, but also a relationship with people who were close to them. And so they had people in the community walk with them through this process of healing, stand in solidarity, encourage, and pray with them. And eventually they had this intentional conversation where the people who were surrounding them and walking with them and the couple all got together, and the spouse shared, the husband, the 3 things that he wanted to ask forgiveness for Like 3 things that he acknowledged that he did wrong, and he wanted to receive forgiveness for these 3 things. And then everybody in the circle wrote down 1 thing that they wanted to forgive him for. And they put it in this box that said forgiven. And then each of them read out the things that they wanted to forgive him for. And then they each affirmed something in him, spoke life into him, encouraged him. And then he made 3 commitments to his wife and to the community. And what I love about this is that this is something that the community, first of all, could have ignored or said, you know, we're not really a part of that, swept it under the rug. But they acknowledged, no, we have been affected by this. This has hurt our relationship. We want to journey with them in a process of healing. They could have shamed this person and rejected them, but instead they came together with an intentional conversation to actually restore this person to community and remove any shame that they were experiencing. To have an intentional conversation, to work through conflict in a healthy way. And I have to believe that that community is much closer because of the conversation that they have had. Conflict doesn't need to be bad. It can be an opportunity to deepen relationship, and we get to choose how we want to respond to it because it's inevitable. The worship team is going to come back up here, and like we do every Sunday at Reunion, we have an opportunity to participate in communion. This is something that we do to remind us of what Jesus has done for us, that on the cross, Jesus has opened the door for us to be a part of God's family forever. That through Jesus and the cross, we are reconciled to God and each other. And the night before Jesus died, he had a last meal with his community. And he passed around a loaf of bread and a cup of wine. And he said, eat, drink, do this in remembrance of me. And so we continue to do it in remembrance of him. But this week, we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of walking up to take communion, you all are going to serve each other. So Megan and Alex, who are serving communion, will walk up and down the aisles and pass it between each other. And so you guys can kind of help us out if there's no one directly next to you. But as you hold this so that the person can take communion, can you say you are part of God's family? And if you know their name, you can say their name. Just as an act of remembering that we are a community, that we stand in solidarity with each other, that we support each other, that we are like family. Conflict is inevitable, and we can choose to approach it as an opportunity to deepen relationship. And there is something that brings us closer together, that binds us, that's even stronger than war or violence or the threat of disaster, and that is Jesus Christ. And so we remember that as we participate in communion. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for the gift of community, for the gift of being a part of your family. God, that anywhere we go, we can find community because there are people who follow you and who are committed to being a part of your family. We just ask, God, that you would help us, lead us so that we exist in this community in a way that is loving and supportive of each other. In your name we pray. Amen.